Professor Jones. I'm very happy to be talking to you today. Professor Jones is one of the most instrumental person that has worked in Mauritius since the late 70s on biodiversity and conservation. If we still have in Mauritius today the echo parakeet, if we have the kestrel, and we have so many different reptiles, the pink pigeon, and how biodiversity has been able to survive. One of the most important person, I would say, that was hands-on since the start is Professor Carl Jones. And we are very honored to have him with us today. And he will talk a bit about how important the protection and conservation of biodiversity in Mauritius is for us Mauritians, and also for the importance it has for the world. Thank you for joining us, Professor Jones.
Thank you. Thank you, Adish. That's a lovely introduction, and I'm not sure whether I deserve it or not. But yes, I've been involved with Mauritius now for over 40 years, and we've had a lot of wonderful successes. And I should say that although I've been involved in a number of those successes, it's because we've been able to work collaboratively with young Mauritians, both in the government and in the private sector, but also bringing in expertise from outside and helping to restore some of those critically endangered species. When we think of Mauritius, we think of a wonderful tropical island. And of course, most people identify Mauritius with the dodo, a bird that has disappeared. The last one was seen in 1662, and a lot of people think that its extinction was inevitable. And they say, oh, the dodo, it was such a silly bird, it was bound to become extinct. Well, actually, that's not strictly true. It was beautifully adapted to the island of Mauritius, and it was wiped out by the early colonizers and the animals they brought, such as pigs and cats and monkeys and so on. But in addition to the dodo, we've lost a lot of other wonderful species of plants and animals. And when I started to get involved with Mauritius in the 1970s, I said to myself, isn't it a great shame that this beautiful island is associated with something which is very negative? The loss of a unique bird, the dodo, but also the loss of many other species. And I kept thinking, well, what we should be associated with is something positive, saving species and rebuilding the systems that we have in Mauritius, the natural systems. And when I started my work in 1979, I was sent over by international organizations to work in Mauritius for a year or two with some of the most critically endangered species. These are some of the ones you've already mentioned, the Mauritius kestrel, the pink pigeon, and also the Mauritius parakeet, the echo parakeet. And at the time, these species were so critically endangered that many felt that their extinction was unavoidable, that we were going to lose them. Anyway, we persevered and we worked very hard on those species, and I was able to encourage the investment from a number of international organizations. And we were able to save the kestrel, the pigeon, and the echo parakeet. And I should point out that at one time, the Mauritius kestrel was the world's rarest bird. In 1974, there were only 4 individuals left in the world. The echo parakeet in the late 1980s declined to just a handful of birds. We're not sure exactly how many, but perhaps 8 to 12 known birds. And the pink pigeon in the early 1990s declined to just 9 or 10 wild birds. So we're talking about species that went down to a very, very low level. But I knew deep down that all these species were savable, and that we could, by applying various techniques, by breeding them in captivity, we could encourage the population to grow, then we could restore it into the wild. And when we restored the kestrel, we pigeon, and we started to work with that. And that the numbers of pigeons went up, and then we started to work with the echo parakeet. And by this time, we had a lot of young Mauritians working in conservation. So we were a team, a real dynamic team of Mauritians, but also expatriate expertise. And we were getting a lot of support from international organizations. And I kept saying, what we really need to do is to use these very rare birds that we have recovered to become catalysts for restoring a whole system. And so we restored the birds, and we started lobbying with government that we needed a national park. And it was really quite interesting because I took Anirudh Jagnat and the whole cabinet into the Black River Gorges one day, and I showed them a Mauritius kestrel. You can see there's a print on my wall of a Mauritius kestrel just there. Great. I showed them a Mauritius kestrel, and I also showed them our captive population of echo parakeets, and you can see there's a picture of one just there. And, you know, I said, well, what we really need to be doing is to be looking after the last wild areas of Mauritius and setting up a national park and restoring not just the rare birds, but the whole system. And so in the early 1990s, the government set up the Black River Gorges National Park. I only had a small part to play in that, of course, but, you know, there's a whole team of us that put that together. And of course, the National Park and Conservation Service was founded. And since then, we, international organizations, and the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation have worked alongside our government counterparts, developing conservation, not just the rare species, but also thinking about how we can restore whole systems. We started with the national park, but we were also at the same time looking at some of the small islets around Mauritius. And we said to ourselves, well, it's going to be very difficult to restore the national park back to its original state because it's very degraded, but there are also introduced species there. There are wild cats, there are deer, there are pigs, there are rats. And although we can control them, we can't eradicate them or eliminate them from such a large area. So we said, well, what we need to do is to set up some small islets where there's no on them, and to restore them and try and restore them something like pristine Mauritius was like. We can't turn the clock back, of course we can't. There's been too many changes, but wouldn't it be lovely if we could have some pieces of Mauritius where we had partly restored the original systems? And so we all started working on the islets. We started on Ile Ronde in the north, but also on Ile Azegret in the Maibug Bay. And of course, this is one of the islets that has been so badly affected by the oil. But we said to ourselves, Ile Azegret is such a wonderful place. It's a nature reserve, but we can also restore it. And it is so close to the mainland. We can use it as a bit of a laboratory to learn how to restore islands, but also to show it to school children, to Mauritians, to tourists, to be able to show what Mauritius was once like, so that you could walk on Ile Azegret and get a glimpse 500 years back in time and see some of the beautiful plants and the beautiful animals that would have existed. And I go to Mauritius twice a year, if I'm lucky. And every time I go on to Ile Azegret, and I feel like I'm stepping back in time. I feel like I'm getting a glimpse of what those first colonizers saw of Mauritius. And as I wander across the island, my mind starts to wander, and I see the tortoises we've put back. They're Aldabra tortoises to replace the Mauritian ones, but I can imagine what the original Mauritian tortoises were like. And as you walk across the island, you start to feel the spirit of the dodo and the lost Mauritius. And I think it's a very powerful experience. And what we're trying to do in Mauritius, Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, the National Parks and Conservation Service, and international organizations, is we want to raise the profile of the wonderful creatures that we have in Mauritius and to show people just how important they are. You've got to remember, the dodo was found nowhere else in the world. It was endemic. The pink pigeon is found nowhere else in the world. The Mauritius kestrel, the echo parakeet, the Mauritius fody, a whole series of ebonies, hundreds of plants. They are unique to Mauritius. And what you've got to remember is that as humanity progresses and as we become global, we see people moving around the world and we see homogenization of cultures and countries. And the most precious thing that we have in Mauritius is our identity. I talk about, I'm not Mauritian myself, but I feel spiritually that I'm a Mauritian. It's my second home. But you know, for me, the most important thing about Mauritius is how different it is from the rest of the world. Its people, its culture, the way we live, the beautiful scenery, but also its biodiversity. So when I walk in the Black River Gorges, I cannot even begin to think what that wonderful area would be like if we didn't have pink pigeons and Mauritius kestrels. They are part of the very spirit of the island. And it's really interesting because if we actually look back at Mauritius, Mauritius was a colony until the late 1960s, and people were taught by Jay using the British system. And so young Mauritians at the time learned about biology, learning about sweet peas and common frogs. And they didn't learn about and the giant tortoises and the ebony tree and the beautiful wildlife that exists there. And I think our job is to actually change that, to get people to really embrace their culture, embrace the island, and to realize just how special some of this Mauritian wildlife is. I remember when I went to Mauritius in 1979, I was in my early 20s, and I was invited to a dinner party at the High Commissions, the British High Commissions. And the British High Commissioner was introducing me to the great and the good of Mauritius, and there were all sorts of decision makers there. And I got to meet some of the politicians of the day, and I was introduced, and I was told that Carl is a young biologist who's come out here to help save some of the very rare birds. And I remember speaking to a minister, and I was telling him about the Mauritius kestrel. And he said to me, he said, Mauritius kestrel? But, you know, surely if you go and look elsewhere, you'll find similar kestrels or the same kestrels on Madagascar and in Africa. The only thing that we had here that was unique was the dodo, and that's gone. And I said, no, Mauritius has literally thousands of species found nowhere else in the world. And he could see his eyes are opening. He hadn't realized just how important the island was. And of course, that was a problem of the way people were taught just a generation or so ago. They were taught about species in Africa and species in Britain, but they weren't taught about their own island, Mauritius. And so I think that when we actually look at what's been achieved on Mauritius over the last 40 years, we've achieved a huge amount. But we've still got a lot to do. We've set up nature reserves. We've restored Round Island, or restoring Round Island. We're restoring Îles Egret. We're working with the national parks, helping to restore species in the national park. But we've got a huge amount to do to continue to look after these species and to protect them. And I think the recent oil spill is showing just how vulnerable Mauritius can be from outside effects, from pollution, from introductions of the wrong species. And we're always going to have to nurture and look after the wildlife. And I think that when we actually look back at the events of the last 6 months, we've had COVID, which has shown this disease, this horrible disease spreading across the world. And more recently, we've seen the effects of this oil spill on Mauritius, and we can see just all the threats that are there. And those threats are actually quite interesting because it's made us wake up and realize that one of the most important things we can do is to look after nature. COVID, if we are to believe the experts, and I certainly do believe them, has come from an animal market in China, and it's come because people were trading in wild animals. It has come from because we have brought these animals into a position where we're in contact with them. So we've basically released a disease which would normally be retained within that animal population. And if we look at a number of other diseases that have affected us in recent years, like SARS and a number of other viral diseases, they've all come from wildlife because we have disturbed it, because we are destroying the rainforest, because we are taking these animals and putting them in unnatural situations in markets where they are being traded. So it's basically the result of the abuse of nature. We look at climate change, which has been brought on again by deforestation and by the way we abuse the world. And we see that Mauritius, this beautiful gem of an island in the Indian Ocean, has been so affected by this relatively modest oil spill. But it shows and it illustrates that we need to be looking after these things that are so precious to us: the wildlife, the islands, and the beautiful island of Mauritius.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Jones. I could listen to you as a young student when you were in a lecture theatre listening to your professors. I could listen to you for hours. Thank you very much. I mean, you've said it right. Going to Île aux Aigrettes is really like a time machine, bringing you back in those period of time when humans had not come yet to the island, and the conservation work that was done there is absolutely stunning, and we need to share that. We need to share that to the Mauritians. We need to share that to the world, and show also how fragile that everything is, and if there is I don't really like that word, but a wake-up call that this oil spill has brought, is the time now to keep talking about that and help even more in terms of protecting that treasure.
You're perfectly correct. Of course we have to do that. But also Mauritius is an example to the rest of the world, because some of the species we have recovered, people thought we couldn't recover them. We are showing the world how to restore critically endangered species and to rebuild systems. Now, I started off by saying how Mauritius is associated with the dodo. In the next decade, let's all move forward and make sure that when people think about Mauritius, they don't think about extinction, but they look at us in terms of regenerating and rejuvenating the world.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I couldn't have said it better than you. No one can. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.